Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Fenwick Elliott webinar. My name is Stacey Sinclair. I'm a partner here at Fenwick Elliott, and we are delighted to be back with you today. This is our second webinar of 2024, and thank you very much for joining. Today, we are, of course, talking about disruption and how to prove it. This clearly is a timely topic and a hot topic, as demonstrated by just the sheer number of registrations we've had for this webinar and the audience who's continuing to join us now. So thank you for that. No doubt this is such a hot topic because it's dear to your heart as disruption, which is often confused with delay, as we'll hear about, is constantly plaguing the construction industry, affecting projects of all sizes, all shapes, all scopes, yet it is notoriously difficult to establish. Whilst it might be crystal clear that to everyone that the works are not progressing efficiently, proving it is rather another story. And today we have, to help us with this, Fenwick Elliott's Catherine Butler, a senior associate specializing in dispute resolution in construction, energy, and infrastructure projects, and Alan Whaley, senior managing director at JS Held, who has over 20 years of experience in the UK and international construction, energy, and infrastructure projects, and is now a very, very experienced expert witness in quantum and delay analysis for complex disputes. So welcome both. Thank you very much for being here with us today. Before I turn to our speakers, just a few admin points. Everyone's on mute. Please do submit questions as we go. You'll find the toolbar off to the right of the screen, no doubt. And I will put as many of those as I can at the end of the session. But do rest assured that a copy of the slides and an on-demand recording will be available on our website in due course. And so with that, I shall hand over to Catherine. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. What is going to be, I'm sure, an illuminating journey into the world of disruption. Full disclosure, I have a bit of a cold, and so if I have to sort of break off for a second to cough or sneeze, then I apologize in advance, but normal service will be resumed shortly. On that note, so as with all these subjects that we cover in webinars, we could probably do several sessions on them. So today is going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour of what disruption actually means, and especially what it means in the context of a construction project and all the myriad of different things that could impact on progress, efficiency, and just day-to-day being able to get the works done. So just to set up what we are going to be talking about. So what do we understand disruption to actually mean? And what examples can we think of that you might come across day to day on a construction project, and how they might be impacting on the works? I'm going to talk about what the law and probably a bit more sort of helpful what commentary there is from various sources to help us understand when a project is disrupted, and importantly what you then do when that disruption has occurred. Further to which Alan, who specifically describes this as his specialist subject in a mastermind scenario, not to put too much pressure on him, obviously, but he's going to give us the benefit of his knowledge and experience about the causative angle to disruption, so proving that your project has been disrupted, and then what and how you demonstrate that that has caused the contractor to be to incur loss and expense, and sometimes to be delayed. So without further ado, let's get into what disruption means. I mean, I always find it useful before we start thinking about how specifically this impacts on what we do, is to sort of look at a more sort of definition as provided by the dictionaries. So disruption is described as disturbance or problems which interrupt an event, activity, or process. Bit more expansive, it's the action of preventing something, especially a system, process, or event, from continuing as usual or as expected. So I think taking those definitions at sort of face value, the important part, particularly for when we're looking in construction, is the last part. So a contractor, or should I say, well, a good contractor will have spent a lot of time and effort in planning and sequencing the works in order to properly price it and give a realistic completion date. So when you're doing that planning, that's based on any number of assumptions, but it will also rely on actions, or indeed actions that not to be taken by the employer. So if the contractor is disrupted, it cannot carry out the works in the manner that it had planned, and this can have serious consequences, not less on how much money it's actually going to take to do these works. So turning more specifically to construction, here we've got various synonyms for how we might feel that our activities cannot progress as we had planned for them. So, disturbance, interruption, restriction, but basically all these things will lead to a contractor suffering a loss in the productivity or efficiency, causing decreased output or performance. So I know that Alan's going to touch on this a bit more, but these are quite difficult things to sort of measure. But if we start from understanding, what a disruption event is, and for this, I would always recommend that you go to the SCL protocol on delay and disruption as a good starting point for formulating any disruption claims. So if we look there, the definition that they give to disruption is disturbance, hindrance, or interruption to a contractor's normal working methods, resulting in lower efficiency. Disruption claims relate to loss of productivity in the execution of particular work activities. Because of the disruption, these work activities are not able to be carried out as efficiently as reasonably planned or as possible. So that again links the causative element. So it's because of that disruption, and that is something that Alan is definitely going to bring our attention to. So just thinking about examples, I just as a kind of making sure that we have an understanding. This is all about the employer. So things that the employer was meant to do or didn't do, or actions that that they take that disrupt the contractor's activities. So as an example, imagine that you are working in a greenfield site. Probably one recent experience, you're building a data center. That's what everyone seems to be doing now. Under that contract, the employer was meant to obtain a lease of the adjacent field that the contractor is then to use for storage of materials, plant, equipment, etc. Now, for whatever reason, the employer doesn't get the lease of the adjacent field. Instead, they get a lease of a field that's 5 minutes away. Now, in the overall scheme of things, they're still providing you with that storage that they promised to, but the contractor now has to incur the time and costs of traveling to the alternative storage location. And whereas the contractor had planned their works on the basis of having storage by the adjacent to the site. So that means that the contractor's plans have been disrupted. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of disruption claims, it's important to note, and Stacey alluded to this in the introduction, disruption is not delay. Delay and disruption, possibly because of the SCL protocol and delay and disruption, they're often coupled together, but they are very different animals, as this description given in Hudson makes clear. So delay means a delay to the completion date, and that presupposes the activity which was delayed is on the critical path. Disruption to progress may or may not cause delay to the overall completion, depending on whether the activity delayed is on the critical path, and this will result in additional costs where plant labour is underutilised, etc. So the key distinction here relates to criticality. So a critical delay event causes the overall completion date to be pushed back, and depending on its cause, could entitle the contractor to an EOT and possibly loss and expense. Alternatively, disruption may add significant costs, aggravation and just general faff, but it might never actually impact on the overall completion date and critical path. So that's an important distinction to bear in mind, because particularly when you are looking at your sort of claims as a whole, yes, there might be claims for an EOT and there might be claims for disruption, but because the focus is often on the extension of time and the loss and expense related to prolongation, it actually means that you're not capturing the additional loss and expense that you suffer for distinct events of disruption. So that's something to bear in mind. So you might be missing out on significant elements of your claim because the focus is on delay. So sorry for the various coughing. Okay. So when we're looking at the actual disruption claims, first thing is to think about is, do I have a claim? So here we're looking again at the SCL protocol in terms of in section 18. So looking at this quote, we need to sort of break down the various elements that are required. So you may recover compensation for disruption only to the extent that the contract permits. So this relates to it being an event that you can rely on. So disruption isn't a cause of action in and of itself. So you have to have your contract say that you can claim for being disrupted. So, and again, this relates to, there must be an action that the employer has taken responsibility for that they haven't performed or have disrupted in some other way that you can then rely on. So then the disruption analysis to demonstrate loss of productivity and therefore additional loss and expense over and above that which would have been incurred were it not for the disruption events for which the employer is responsible. So it's not just that you've been disrupted, you have to prove that that disruption has caused you to work inefficiently and that it has cost you additional money. And the claim would only ever be for the over and above what you would have incurred in any event. So these elements are all cumulative. So you have to have them all in order to make a solid claim for disruption. So drawing from that, we have the guidance provided by Mr. Justice Aikenhead in Walter Lilly and Giles McKay. It's actually a case that I was involved in, and I've never been able to shake it off. So, albeit Mr. Justice Aikenhead was talking about this in the context of global claims, he did note the elements of a successful claim and disruption requires the claimant to demonstrate on the balance of probabilities that that an event has occurred which gives rise to an entitlement to loss and expense, that those events cause disruption, and that the disruption caused loss and or expense or damage to be incurred. Now again, these are cumulative. You need to have all three. So Alan is going to be helping us with the second two elements of that. But I am now going to quickly drill down into what events we can actually rely on to kickstart our claims for disruption. So an event occurs giving rise to entitlement to loss and expense. So again, this is something that it has to be an employer obligation or responsibility. It's not a cause of action in its own right. So if we take the JCT standard form, as I've already mentioned, disruption is not delay. So particularly when you're working with the JCT, you've got to remember that that contract makes a distinction between relevant events, which can entitle you to an extension of time, and relevant matters, which can entitle you to loss and expense. So there's a certain amount of crossover, but they are not the same lists. So when you're looking for loss and expense from disruption claims, you have to look at the relevant matters that are set out at clause 421. Now here is just an example of probably the most readily accessible or used relevant matter when it comes to employer disruption. And that's any impediment, prevention or default, whether by act or omission by the employer, except to the extent caused or contributed to by the contractor. So it has to be, you know, if there's a duality in the disruption in terms of a contractor's own inefficiency, that isn't trumped by the employer's act or omission giving rise to the disruption. So also to bear that in mind. But insofar as a contractor can prove that that impediment, prevention or default has occurred, then that's your event giving rise to disruption. When you're looking at the NEC form of contract, that doesn't make any distinction between events which give rise to an EOT and events which give rise to loss and expense. They're all compensation events under that form. So here, those are all listed at clause 60, and here I've just given a couple of examples of the most sort of, you know, likely candidates for disruption events. So the client doesn't provide something which is to provide by the date shown in the accepted program, or there's just more generally a breach of the contract by the client, which is not one of the other compensation events. So linking back to my example of securing a lease of the adjacent field, that will have been a contractual obligation on the employer. Them not specifically obtaining that lease of the adjacent field is a breach of that obligation, and that's your disruption event that you can rely on under contract. So we have our disruption event. Great. Don't stop there. In order to ensure that you get your entitlement for loss and expense, you need to be very aware of any specific notification requirements that there are in your specific contract. So, and if you fall foul of these, it could mean that your recovery is wiped out. So, I mean, I know that sounds quite dramatic, but it's absolutely a possibility. So this is particularly the case when you're working with NEC or FIDIC contracts, which include strict time bars in relation to notifying and providing particulars of a disruption event. So these are called condition precedents, and they need to be satisfied ahead of basically the entitlement kicking in at all. And although I note the NEC and the FIDIC contracts that they do come with built-in condition precedents, I'm seeing more and more that JCT forms which don't include in the standard form any condition precedents, more and more employers' amendments to say that you have to notify within a certain time period after an event has occurred before any entitlement can flow. So just very much something to be aware of, because I mean, this is something that people often sort of cite as, that's really unfair, because, you know, I have an entitlement, I have been disrupted. Just because I didn't send my notice means that I don't get anything. And unfortunately, yes. I'm sorry not to be able to sugarcoat that, but condition precedents have time and again been upheld as valid, and I particularly draw your attention to the leading case on this, which is Bremner and Vanden. So a condition precedent will be valid so long as it details the precise time frame within which an action should be taken, i.e. issuing the notice, and details in clear and express language the consequences of any failure by the claiming party to take that action within that time frame. So if you've signed up to a contract that says my entitlement is dependent on me having notified you, the employer, within X days of an event that might cause disruption and or delay, loss and expense, etc., then you will be held to them. So just very much flagging that. And I think that the cautionary tale that we see in the Van Ord and Allseas case, which I've set out on the slide, is something for us all to bear in mind. So the contractor encountered ground conditions very much less favourable than they had planned for. So whether or not they would be entitled, you know, in the end, given necessarily difficult to prove that you're entitled to extra time and or money because of ground conditions. But in the end, the contractor here couldn't recover anything because they had to notify within 5 days of the occurrence of any such event. And they missed that deadline by a mere 2 days. And it's binary, it's all or nothing. You make that deadline or you don't. So once you've established that you have an event of disruption, make sure that you've done everything else that you need to do under the contract. So if we call back to the 3 requirements that Mr. Justice Aikenhead set out in Walter Lilly, I'm now going to pass over to Alan, who's going to talk us through how best to demonstrate that the event caused disruption and how that disruption eventuated in losses being suffered.
Thank you very much, Catherine. That was excellent. Very interesting. So as Catherine says, I'm going to take us through now a few more technical aspects of how we might go about preparing a claim to prove and quantify the claim. That's going to be my focus for the next few minutes. So before I start, let me just get round some terminology, just so we can talk about these things precisely. The first term I want to introduce is the term production. So when I talk about production, we're just talking about the amount of work we produce over time. We can then also think about productivity, which is simply the number of hours it takes to produce a unit of work. So we might talk about hours per meter cube, person days per floor, that sort of thing. And we also hear about efficiency, don't we? And what does that mean? Efficiency is simply the difference between the planned and the actual productivity. So if you're working efficiently, you're meeting or beating your planned productivity. And if you're working inefficiently, you're not meeting your planned productivity. So I make this point simply to say that we hear lots of terms like lost efficiency, low productivity, that sort of thing. They all basically mean the same thing. When we're proving a disruption claim, we're trying to show how many additional hours were worked, probably as a result of the matters that we're relying on in the disruption claim. So hopefully that just clears up a few terms that I'm going to talk about in a moment. The next thing I want to do is before we get into sort of methodologies and all the academics of disruption claims, which are all very interesting, I guess, we have to first think about the basics, which is obviously having good enough records. Now, there's a relationship between the strength of your disruption claim and the records that you have available. So if you have any idea that you're going to make a disruption claim on a project, really, you've got to organize your project controls in anticipation of making a disruption claim. It's very hard after the event to make a strong disruption claim if the records aren't there. So at a minimum, we need to have some kind of idea about what we budgeted for the work, some kind of tender breakdown, and we also need to understand how many hours we spent. And we might just pass the threshold for a global disruption claim, but that's unlikely to be very persuasive. In reality, we need much more information. So we really do need very detailed records of things like what the disruption causes were, how much work we were performing over the time. So that might be the percentage of work at a minimum. And if we really want to make a strong disruption claim, ideally we're going to have very detailed daily records. So these are things like daily timesheets, ideally at the activity level. So we should know how many hours we've spent on Tuesday to put up the ducts on level 2, for example. We need to understand the quantity of ducts that we installed on level 2. And ideally, we would also have a daily record of what caused the disruption to the ducts on level 2. Now, to the extent you haven't got those sorts of records, which frankly is quite normal in the construction industry, you have to accept that you may not be able to measure disruption accurately or at all in some cases. So there are solutions to that, and we'll go through some of those in a minute. But just bear that in mind, particularly if you're working for a main contractor. Generally, you're passing down the risk to this sort of thing to your subcontract supply chain, and it's all their problem apparently. Do think about whether that's the right approach if ultimately you are going to raise a disruption claim. For specialist subcontractors, it's probably slightly easier, isn't it? Because you should have at least more direct access to things like labour records and quantity records. But it's really, really important. We don't want to skip past this extremely important point. So let's think about how we might then address and approve a disruption claim with different sorts of records. There are probably 3 main methods. I can list a few other ones, but probably a bit too wacky to talk about today. But there are 3 main methods that we're going to commonly use to prove disruption. And essentially in all these records, we're just trying to show 2 things, as Catherine said, that disruption events occurred, and crucially that it somehow impacted on the productivity, the efficiency of our construction work. And the relevant test is on a balance of probability. So we only need to prove that these things probably did happen, and they probably did cause a loss of a certain degree. So that's the overarching objective of all these methods. We'll start with the earned value method. Essentially what we're doing in earned value method is we're making a reconciliation of the hours that we budgeted for an amount of work performed in a given month or week, and we're comparing that budgeted number of hours to the actual hours. So an earned value is focusing on the levels of production that you made on, say, a discipline, say mechanical or block work, and you're comparing the number of hours that you produced or budgeted for the work with the hours that you actually worked. So I've showed a worked example here on the screen, which relates to some block work, and we had disruption in the period that's highlighted there in the middle in window 2. So one thing that's quite useful to do in a disruption claim is like a delay analysis, break it down into time periods or windows, and that helps us to distinguish the effects of different events at different times. But in this analysis, what we've done is we've taken the budgeted hours over here each month for the work that we performed, block work, and we've taken the actual hours for the work performed. And because we've isolated these hours to relate to a specific discipline and hopefully an area on the project, we should now be able to see a meaningful trend. And if we are in fact disrupted, we ought to see the gap between the budgeted and the actual hours increasing, right? Now, one thing that's really important in an earned value analysis is that inevitably there'll be accusations that the contractor underpriced the job, or the hours loaded into its program are insufficient for the job. And those criticisms are generally quite valid. So one of the important things that we need to do often is make an adjustment to the budgeted hours to recognise that the contractor itself may have had inefficiencies that weren't planned for. Maybe the contractor didn't allow anything for snagging, or maybe the contractor didn't allow anything for overtime working, whatever it was. So it's necessary to make an adjustment. So in this worked example, what we can see in window 1, having made an adjustment, we have lost 30 hours in that window. But crucially, this is before the disruption event has happened. So the crucial point here is that in window 2, this is the period in which the disruption occurred, we can see a reduction, or sorry, an increase in the number of hours that we're losing in that period. And then in window 3, we see a reduction in the additional hours. And in window 3, that's the period in which the disruption event had ended. So what this proves, somewhat indirectly, but usually sufficient if it's backed up with evidence, is that there has been a change in efficiency, because we are losing more hours in the period of disruption compared to the periods in which we weren't disrupted. So I've just visualized that here. We have in the green line, we have our budgeted hours, which have been adjusted a bit for our own inefficiencies. And then we have the red line, which is the actual hours. So you'll never achieve perfection in this sort of thing, but effectively we're claiming for the gap between the green line and the red line. It's basically a planned versus actual calculation, but crucially, we're dividing it into time periods so we can see the trend in that difference between planned and actual hours. And that's the whole point of an earned value analysis. So what we can do is then calculate the disruption something like as follows. We can say that in window 2, we spent about 3,600 hours doing the block work. But we think, having adjusted the budget to reflect what we were actually achieving before or after window 2, we should deduct a notional budget of around 3,000 hours. And that gives us around 500 hours or 15% loss of efficiency. And that would be our disruption claim, or the basis of it. We just need to add the relevant hourly rates to that figure. Now, this isn't a solution in all cases, but it is a nice solution because it's quite easy to perform. And it's used most often, I would say, in the construction industry, because you've seen we're not relying on any actual production data. So we don't need to specifically look at the amount of work that we produce, the linear meter, the meter squared, the meter cubed. We can use a blend of different activities, and in many cases we have to, because of that's the detail of information we have available. So we use this quite frequently for that reason. The issue is, though, to the extent that our actual hours are not detailed, the strength of this analysis reduces. So if we have very detailed actual hours, we can make very detailed reconciliations to area, to location, to time period, and that's great. However, more often we don't. We just have monthly hours, say, for a discipline like mechanical or electrical. And obviously then the level of analysis is much higher level, and the strength of our claim reduces. And also, this adjustment that we make to our budgeted hours, we have to assess that on a case-by-case basis. So there's a degree of subjectivity. Obviously, if you're the claimant, you're not going to want to make an adjustment, and that itself can be a cause of dispute. And also, if you've got multiple disruption causes, this analysis alone only gives you an overspend. It might not, or it probably won't give you a way to allocate the hours to different events if you have any, and that can be a problem as well. The one that everybody thinks of is this one, the measured mile analysis. So here, we're not measuring production, we're measuring productivity. So now we need to have information around the amount of work we produced in quantities. So in this, using the same example in blocks, so meter square blocks. And we also need to know the number of hours it took to produce each unit of work. So in this case, the gang hours. So if we have both of those pieces of information, honestly, this is one of the simplest claims you can prepare, because all you're effectively doing is working out the productivity by comparing the number of hours to the quantity of work performed. That gives us the productivity rate down here. And if we do that over time again, this is the crucial factor, we can look for trends in changes in that productivity. And if we see an alignment with a reduction in productivity that aligns with the disruptive events, then we can argue that that is not a coincidence. It's a result. It's the events have caused that reduction in productivity. So in exactly the same way, we've got a series of windows, and we can measure our productivity before or after the disruption event. And what we see is our productivity is a bit lower than what was planned here. 1.33 productivity planned, 1.33 meters squared per hour. Before we were only doing 1.19, after we were only doing 1.27. But crucially, during the disruption period, there's an observable and quite serious decrease to productivity to only 1 meter square per gang hour. So it's in terms of evidence, it's relatively clear that period of disruption is different to the periods before and after. So again, we can measure that. We can see that we planned to do 1.33. That didn't happen even before and after this disruption event, but we can see it. We can show the tribunal, we can show the adjudicator the reduction in productivity. That's the idea of a measured mile analysis. So the only real difference here is we're measuring productivity. We're not relating our assessment to production alone. So we can use the productivity measurements that we've taken, again, to compare the productivity we achieved before the disruption event in the non-disrupted period to the productivity we achieved during the disruption period. And coincidentally, we get a very similar measurement to our earned value analysis. So we still get around 500 hours, but crucially using a very different approach in terms of focusing on productivity. So this is regarded as a stronger method. It's very intuitive, people understand it, and it is derived directly from contemporary evidence in this case, because we are measuring actual productivity. So those are the benefits of it, and most people regard this as being the sort of gold standard method. The problem is you probably won't see this used very much in the industry. It's frankly very rare for contractors to keep such daily detailed records to be able to show an adjudicator what the actual productivity achieved was. Maybe a specialist subcontractor has these sorts of records, but main contractors will probably struggle. Also, one thing that's often overlooked is if you've got multiple disruption causes, again, this method doesn't lend itself to necessarily being able to allocate the additional hours that you've measured to those different causes. And that might be an issue for a tribunal or an adjudicator if they're having to resolve a dispute with different arguments around the liability or entitlement for different events. So because of both of those reasons, but primarily frankly the lack of records that generally exist in our industry, we rarely see this used. So don't beat yourself up if you're not able to do this on your job. You're probably in the same position as many other people trying to achieve these measurements. The last method I want to show is something that's often overlooked, and you won't see it written in a textbook, but in fact it's probably used more often than both of the above combined, because if I'm instructed as an expert witness and I don't have the sorts of records to produce an earned value analysis and very commonly measured mile analysis, what do I do? Do I say, oh, sorry, I can't help you? The answer is no, of course. What we can do is simply investigate the records and look for evidence of disruption in the records. And what I've done here is exactly that. I've made a list of all the different disruption events I've found in all the progress records I've found. And then for each and every one of those events on a case-by-case basis, I've made an assessment or an estimate in some cases of how many hours were probably lost. So everything's factual in there apart from my assessment, and doing the best I can in each case. I've tried to work out in this instance how many shifts were lost or worked in addition without producing work. So this can be a valid method if you've obviously got the records to be able to do this, and obviously you can present it in a way that can be easily understood as well. So what I've done here is I've taken my assessment and I've divided it up into different causes of disruption and also divided it up based on my instructions on whose fault it was. So don't overlook just making an assessment. Often people default straight to the academic mathematical calculations, when in fact something like this is extremely useful to support those sorts of calculations, the earned value and the measured mile, or indeed it can be used alone. So this is very simple and easy to perform. It's derived from contemporary records, and in this case it is suitable for multiple disruption causes. The limitations, however, are quite significant, and that is basically our estimates are to a degree subjective. So ideally we have evidence. If we have a timesheet that says how many hours we were waiting around, I'd prefer to use that than make up a number, but still unlikely that we're going to have that sort of information every time. We do still need very detailed daily and weekly records. So if you don't have these records, I'm afraid you're going to not be able to do something like this. And this is obviously very time consuming, perhaps more time consuming than doing those mathematical calculations in the spreadsheets, because this actually does require you to roll up your sleeves and perhaps review more information than you otherwise would. So just to sort of go around full circle and think about then what records and what approaches we can use depending on those records, I've tried to sketch out here the different approaches that we've just discussed and the types of records that we'd need. So you can see with an earned value analysis, in theory, the records that we need are somewhat lighter. We only really need monthly records. They don't necessarily need to be split down into specific quantities. A percentage of work performed each month might suffice, and we only need a general idea about our disruption causes at minimum. To do a measured mile analysis, though, we need much more detailed records, and specifically daily records of both time spent on activities and records of work performed. And we probably need a more detailed list of disruption events to be able to explain the information in sufficient detail, given that we now have that detail to explain. And you can see if we're just simply making an assessment from the contemporary records, plainly we're less interested in quantities of work and productivities. We're going more directly to the events themselves, but so here we're heavily reliant on the records. So none of these methods are foolproof. They all have certain limitations, as you can see, but these are the sorts of things we can use, hopefully, to prove your disruption claim. That's it from me.
Fantastic. Alan, Catherine, thank you very much. In the time that we've had allowable, that's been brilliant, so clear and concise to take us through what is a massively misunderstood, or can be a massively misunderstood topic. So thank you so much. We will now turn to questions. We have about 10 minutes or so. And thank you everyone to the audience for sending in questions. We now have so many questions that I'm afraid we definitely are not going to get through all of them, but please do, in any event, I'm sure Catherine and Alan would be very happy for you to reach out to them after the webinar to field any of those. But just taking a few, and thank you to those who submitted them in advance as well. That's been really helpful. Let's start with this one. What role do contract programs, dates play, especially sequences, when assessing disruption? Will adjudicators, judges appreciate sub-clauses where main contractors have the provision to resequence the works with no recourse for loss and expense to subcontractors if in dispute? I don't know if Alan maybe.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting question. I think there's probably two questions there. The first part of the question relates to, how much regard is given to the contract program and the planned sequence. Well, I think a lot of regard has to be given to the contract program, because one of the elements of proving disruption is to show that you have somehow incurred some kind of change to the ways you're working and the methods of working. So at the very minimum, you ought to be able to show in the contract program the sorts of assumptions that you made as a contractor to build the project. It's also very useful to understand that the number of hours that you might have needed to allow, that being directly linked to obviously the duration of different activities as well. So I think it has a few uses, perhaps not on its own significantly relevant, but I think as background information, it is relevant. I think the second half of the question relates to contract clauses, where contractors have to resequence the work but have no cause to loss and expense. I think that always depends on the wording of the contract. Obviously, it's partly a legal point, but what I would say is those sorts of clauses, need to be looked at in terms of degree. If there is separately a clause in the contract that says, if there's a relevant matter, the contractor is entitled to loss and expense, then I think those clauses need to be read together. So I think that the idea that such a clause would entirely rule out a disruption claim is a different thing altogether. I think there is an ability to resequence work without cost or at low cost. But I think that if you incur additional loss and expense, then it's definitely worth thinking about whether in fact that stands alone. And of course, people like Fenwick Elliott will be pleased to assist you with the particular questions on contract clauses. But yes, I wouldn't say from what that question said, if I understood it correctly, that situation necessarily rules out any prospect of a disruption claim.
Well, just on that point, that obviously if the contract has a specific setting out of requirements, but always remember that there's a duty on the contractor to mitigate. So insofar as you can resequence and or work differently to make up for the disruption, then you're required to do that anyhow. So it's not just about what specifically you're asked to do in the contract, but you have a broader duty to mitigate, which you mustn't forget.
Fantastic, thank you both. And yes, I can confirm that Fenwick Elliott would indeed be happy to help anyone out there with those clauses. Right, moving on to the next question, I think. We've had two coming in relating to the NEC, so I think maybe we'll take two of those. The first one is, you will know that frequently contract amendments require full particulars need to be sent within 3 days from one main contractor and to the satisfaction of the contractor, and when you, the subcontractor, ought to have become aware of the same, in short. So tricky to submit full in a few days, and especially with the NEC timeout clauses. I know, Catherine, you referred to some of this earlier on. Did you want to field this one?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some absolute corkers recently in terms of just what the employer is requiring contractors to provide. I mean, if a requirement is wholly sort of unreasonable / impossible, then you can always seek to undermine these clauses by saying that they're unenforceable. But when you're in commercial organization, this isn't unfair terms. The contracts are negotiated between what people say, comparatively sophisticated, advised people, companies. It might be really difficult, but it doesn't mean you have to do it. This is something, if you are aware of these particularly draconian requirements under a contract, then it's your responsibility to resource that internally and make sure that you are keeping all possible records. There's always potential for a debate about when something occurs, or when it occurs, or when you ought to have known it occurs, and that will depend on the wording of your contract. But if you can provide whatever you can provide by the time, then we have a fighting chance to argue it. But you've got to put in whatever you can, notwithstanding it's difficult.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think a lot of the fear that people have with very draconian time bars is that their project control systems aren't set up in a way that enables them to quickly lift out information that they need to provide these so-called full particulars. So if you haven't got that level of information being produced in any event, then you have to go and search for it, and then it becomes a much bigger problem. So again, it just goes back to exactly what Catherine said. You do need to put the resources in place before you have a problem so that you can respond promptly. However, I would say that, you know, the term full, it's a bit subjective. You know, I guess if you've submitted something and made a good attempt, it's much harder for your opponent to prove that you haven't given these full particulars, because that must be read in terms of, you know, 3 days or whatever the time period is. So there must be a degree of flexibility in terms of interpreting the words like fully, because they're not precise words, are they? So I think if you can make an effort, exactly as Catherine said, the main thing is to submit something, because certainly submitting nothing will not satisfy that clause.
Fantastic, thank you. And someone has just submitted the question, can you submit partial particulars? And I think you have just addressed that one. Fantastic. And another NEC question. Under NEC 3 ECC option A, if a disruptive matter occurs and the contractor ultimately finishes no later than the last accepted program, are they due compensation for what might be viewed as lost opportunity to have otherwise saved money?
I think so, yes, because the contractor's cost, if the contractor can prove that its cost increased under NEC, then it's entitled to the difference in the cost, so long as the cost increased due to a compensation event. So just in the normal way, I don't think the contractor would have budgeted a cost for things like time risk allowances. They're really there to give the contractor contingency for its own risks. So really that's an entirely separate matter. So I wouldn't confuse time risk allowances in a program with a disruption claim, which is essentially a measurement of how much additional costs that you've incurred compared to what you would have incurred. So I don't think the two issues are actually linked.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Alan. Catherine, I think this next one probably goes back to something you were speaking on earlier. Well, and indeed, at the outset of this session, I said that, and in the introduction to this, it can be crystal clear to everyone on site that the works aren't progressing efficiently, but proving and quantifying the disruptive event can be challenging. So if that's the case, if it's crystal clear, why does not on the balance of probability come into play?
Right. Well, I mean, I think it's from the information that Alan's given us, it's difficult to demonstrate and to show, because there might be a myriad of disrupting events and or other factors. So you can see, as in it's crystal clear on site, that disruption is taking place and inefficient working is happening, but you have to be able to link that disruption to that event that is the employer's responsibility. So it's the causative thread between the two. And I mean, balanced probabilities is a term that we all understand it, because that's your the standard of proof in civil matters. Is is it more likely than not that the employer event caused the disruption? What that doesn't mean is that the contractor gets the benefit of the doubt when there is, the burden of proof is on the contractor to show that it was disrupted by the employer responsibility. Merely showing that there is disruption won't cut it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the balance of probability involves two steps, doesn't it? The first is, did the employer probably cause some disruption? And for every claim, there's a defence. So the employer is going to be suggesting very strongly that it didn't. So you've got that threshold to overcome. And the second is, did the contractor probably incur a loss? Exactly what Catherine said earlier. And then again, there are various other factors which might involve contractors incurring losses: poor performing subcontractors, poor supervision. In fact, there's a whole range of risks that contractors accept in their contracts, implicitly or explicitly. So the balance of probability isn't a solution to a poor claim. it helps you to understand that you don't need to prove every single penny every minute, but you know, there is still a hell of a lot of work to do to pass the threshold to make a complete stranger to your job accept your argument that you have incurred some significant disruption and it's caused a loss and it's the employer's fault. So, you know, don't underestimate that level of evidence.
Great, thank you both. Maybe just one more question, Alan. We've had a lot of questions come in on earned value, measured mile, and the other methods that you're talking about. But since we were just talking about, you know, there's other factors that could be going on that, you know, need to be taken into account. One question that has come in on the earned value method. How do you consider the contractor's own delay within that method?
Yeah, so the basic thing that you do is that you adjust the budgeted hours, and the best way to do that is to look at periods, a bit like a measured mile, where the contractor was progressing without disruptive events. So if you have a look back at the slide when you get a chance, you'll see that in the first window, the adjustment is approximately made to make sure the contractor, the budgeted hours are increased to cover the amount of hours the contractor was spending on comparable work. So you can do it like that as a first step. You can say, let's adjust the budget to account for the contractor's inefficiencies or delays. However, there might then be particular factors, particular events that the contractors experience that are its risk in that period. So really at that point, you have to go back to the contemporaneous records and make an assessment. You have to divide up the hours as best you can to recognize those things. So that simply involves two steps. Firstly, in the particular window of your earned value analysis, recognizing what the main causes of disruption were, irrespective of whether it's employer or contractor. So you need to have an open mind and read the records. And then secondly, the slightly harder bit is to think about how you can divide up those hours. So for example, COVID might be the contractor's risk for costs. So we can make an assessment of, say, the time lost each day for COVID. There might be an oversupply of labour. We might think that the contractor has too much labour on the site. Maybe it hasn't demobilised labour that it should have demobilised. So we can make an assessment of that. So all of this is case by case, but it is necessary in most cases, in fact, to carry out this exercise after calculating the earned value variances and additional hours. And unfortunately, the only way to do that is to roll up your sleeves, identify the different factors of disruption, and then assess each one in the best possible way. There are millions of ways to do it. It all depends on the situation. But you know, don't be afraid to do this. It's really, really important that you at least attempt to do so.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alan. And I think with that, we will wrap up the questions. But Alan and Catherine, thank you so much for today. Catherine, I hope you feel better soon. And with that, all that we have for you, I just want to mention in the usual way for those who join us regularly that we will have our upcoming webinars continuing on. There will be one in March, so please do look out for those. You can use the QR code there to subscribe. And also, if you're interested in our know-how and newsletters, you can find those there on our website. But thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. We hope to see you again soon on one of our upcoming webinars. And with that, thank you very much. I hope everyone is safe and well, and see you soon. Thank you again.
Thanks, everyone. See you soon.
Thanks. Bye.